that Arto's work on Homo Datum is basically going to serve, if you will, as a heuristic moment, of course, open to many suggestions and revisions as we go forward. The reading for next week in particular will be Tony Wilden's System and Structure, which is on the Institute website. If everybody, this is the book, but the entire text, it's called one of the Tavistock Classics, and that's the series it's in, which is interesting. Chris is in London, and in London, Tavistock Clinic was the famous place that R.D. Laing practiced. It was first occupied by Anna Freud. That was her London moment at Tavistock Clinic. I think it's off the Russell Square tube. Yeah. And anyway, Tavistock's a very famous place for Langian psychology, anti-psychiatry movements, as well as a place of real struggle. So for him to you see it every day. Okay, great. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't have the force it used to, of course. But anyway, and this is where the famous Mary Barnes case came out. Which was a kind of journey of non-hierarchized psychiatry, and the Mary Barnes case became very famous. Winnicott, Belindt, the object relations people who are all first rank, in my judgment, and we're all there too. But very famous for the Laing interventions as well. And Foucault visited there, and I think very connected to Tavistock as well. Foucault's first book was Mental Illness and Psychology. And then from there, he went on to this very elaborate analysis of dream of an existence, the case of reported by Ludwig Binswanger of Abbie Warburg, of the banking family, the Warburgs, So very interesting moment, this Tavistock. So anyway, going back to Wilden, we're going to read Analog and Digital Communication. It's dense, but I think it's very prevalent for us next week and something that we can really work with. Maybe we'll have time to introduce it today. But again, this is a work worth studying, revisiting, and rethinking system and structure. We're only reading a very small part of it. I can mention other chapters, once we get to it, that I think is very interesting. Beth, I think you would probably like the section, the chapter in the book on the scientific discourse as propaganda. He's very good in this thing, and I think Michael chapter influenced Stanley on science as power.
But Michael, I think we forgot to mention which chapter we should focus on.
Chapter 7. I put it out in an email to everybody. Yeah, okay. It's on the website and in the announcement tonight. So we would be doing chapter 7 next week, more in detail. Maybe introduce it a little bit tonight. Analog and digital communication. Yeah. So I wanted to go back again to Stiegler. I want to thank both Patrick for mentioning chapter 6 of first volume of Capital, which I went back and read, and chapter 9 was also mentioned on surplus last week, and how maybe to read that alongside Stiegler and then kind of resituate Stiegler vis-a-vis Marx, even though the entire pharmacology of the proletariat is trying to think through a new level, if you will, of what capital does, and this notion of grammatization. I found a paper in which he talks about grammatization, so I'm going to share that with the group this week. I have to download it, but I found it, so you'll get a better sense of what Bernard Stiegler means in terms of this epochs of grammatization. Instead of epochs of being, like Heidegger does, Stiegler likes epochs of grammatization. So anyway, the work section, I think, is interesting in a way. By the way, the term systemic stupidity comes from Maurizio Lazzarato, which is on page 67. Very interesting how he uses this vis-a-vis the cooperation between brains as is produced by grammatization of all those tasks connected at the highest levels of nervous system activity. And this results in the formation of systemic stupidity. And he uses Alan Greenspan's testimony. And remember, this is written 2008, 2009. It's situated within the financial meltdown to explain to the House how he could, in all sincerity, have led the world to the brink of catastrophe, right? Remember, Greenspan said, we're on the brink of catastrophe, of which he helped create it. And then the whole thing of Bernard Madoff. Anyway, I thought the interesting thing here again is that he starts to open up something called the digital pharmakon as a post-Marxist and situationist one. And this is on page 68. I mean, I'm just throwing out terms that I think we can really work with as we go forward. The economy of contribution, which is Stiegler's answer to the, if you will, the associated world of producers that Marx used early on in the economic and philosophical manuscripts and occasionally afterwards. So this is a reply to Marx in terms of the new moment of the digital pharmakon, to make possible of the proletarianization of the nervous system, but also introduces, and again, this notion of the pharmakon that's both the poison, the digital, pharmakon, right, is both the poison, but also the remedy, and that it introduces a possibility of a new regime of psychic and collective individuation and the possibility of new processes of trans-individuation, opening into an unprecedented political economic perspective, that is, as an economy of contribution. So he wants to look at this in terms of short circuits, etc., and what he takes from someone called Jean Moulier-Boutin, who's a philosopher in France, as a positive pharmacology, an associated socio-technical milieu in which struggles are waged against the effects of the spread of disassociated milieus, that is, proletarianized milieus. So the disassociated milieu becomes that of the increasing proletarianization of the central nervous system. And I think this is very important for our time. We speak in terms of misinformation, disinformation, overload of information, et cetera. Stiegler is trying to frame this in terms of a proletarianized milieus, disassociated milieus versus the associated socio-technical milieus in which the struggle is waged. So he's really into this notion of the milieu, right? And it allows struggles to be waged against environmental destructions, right? Opens a field of industrial and commercial relations, which nullifies basically the producer-consumer operation. So again, he's thinking maybe in utopian terms, but trying to set up a discourse that breaks down the binaries, if you will, of producer and consumer. And we can talk about this thing. And then the dialogical that we mentioned last time that he borrows from Mikhail Bakhtin, who I really recommend reading, especially the dialogical imagination. The first chapter on Plato's dialogues are the beginning of the event of the novel. Bakhtin was a Russian, who used to roll his cigarette paper. He would take parts of his dissertation, which was on Rabelais in his world, and he would use that as cigarette rolling paper. It's very amazing. He would
during the war because of the shortage.
What's that? I'm sorry.
During the war, right? World War II, because of the shortage of cigarettes.
Exactly. An amazing character. He was known as Voloshinov. If people are interested in it, I'm certainly very interested in this, Marxism and the philosophy of language and the distinctions between sign and of course, signaling, right? The difference which he begins this with. And again, we can go back there. But the dialogical, he basically wants to talk about a new thing, this economy of contribution. So we're going to return to this because towards the end, or as we get more involved here, we're going to really talk about possible alternatives. ones that may be viable, and also part of the, Patrick has seen this somewhat, Stiegler's own engagement in the north end of Paris, in the suburbs, and how he participated in everyday struggles in terms of the formation of these kind of economy of contributions and, associated milieus, right? So again, the whole work, right? So again, this is the next part is about positive otium, and the possible externalities. And he really wants to go into what he calls studious leisure, right? It's very interesting. Was the beginning of the term of otium. And I like this too, because basically Stiegler, on the other side of this, also has a notion of the aristocracy of the book. So studious leisure may be a term that we can go back to as well. And this is on page 53, which originated in the military context, right? The noble aspect. He said it's a time of noetic intermittence that is the condition of the possibility of negotiatium, right? In a way. And I wish we could communicate this to the Gaza Strip these days, that this is what negotiation really is, in a sense, and its origin. That is employment time, the time of employment. How do we get this negotiatium, right? Negotiatium in process. What does this mean in a sense of work? This notion of employment time. So this again, is again, I think a real updating, if you will, of the Boltanski-Chiapella book, The New Spirit of Capitalism, but it also is attempting to keep the Marxist focused in the foreground very, very much. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts or questions? Because this again, one thing that he did not read here, and I wrote an email concerning this. He did not mention Aronowitz and DeFazio's great study called The Jobless Future. Yeah, and which was an excellent book. I think it's much more important a book and much more denser a book than Jeremy Rifkin's The End of Work, right? And he only cites Jeremy Rifkin. I don't think Stiegler knew of The Jobless Future at all, right? So, again, we can talk about this too, about this switch, if you will, from surplus value into speculative capital, how this whole derivative endeavor started. Stiegler is also somewhat has very interesting ideas about that. I think another section that's very interesting, and Arto may want to comment on this, the bourgeoisie swept away by the mafia, right? Which is very interesting section. The historical failure of communism was due to the fact it could not think association. So, this is a loaded proposition, but that is, it renounced the struggle against proletarianization as loss of knowledge and against the short circuits in individuation, clearly characteristics, what he calls Stalinist bureaucratic totalitarianism. That's again another loaded term. And
Michael,
yeah.
Sorry, what page are you on?
Oh, page 60. I'm sorry, I'm moving too quickly. I know. Okay, yeah.
60.
I just drove 350 miles, so I'm still flying from the fast ride from New York to Montreal. Yeah, it's called The Bourgeoisie Swept by the Mafia. And this may be a good entry point to go to Homo Datum and talk about, some of Arto's principles in the Homo Datum, or any comments you may have on how he sees work differently, as, in this whole notion of proletarianization. But the sentence that, the historical failure of communism, was due to the fact that it could not think association. Okay.
But what does that mean?
I'm not
a fan of this paragraph because
no, I know you're not.
I'm not sure it's accurate, but I'm interested.
That's why I'm going there. It renounced the struggle. That is, it That is, it renounced the struggle against proletarianization as loss of knowledge and against the short circuits in individuation, transindividuation, the clear characteristics of the Stalinist bureaucratic total, just as they are the totalitarianism that is conducted by marketing. It is only in terms of ways of disassociating that capitalism and communism have distinguished themselves from one another. From those Marxists who were situated outside of Stalinism and were against, were never able to manage a critique of dissociation because from the beginning they confused proletarianization and pauperization. So maybe this is a loaded section. We can have a little discussion, with Arto and the rest of you to talk about this. Why would he do this, and what does he mean? I mean, of course, how the bourgeoisie was swept away by the mafia, because he sees communism as a failure in terms of collective individuation and the lack of, ultimately, of association, the failure of, if you will, Bolshevik revolution, and further. So Arto, you want to comment on this? This is fine with me.
I mean, I don't have anything substantial to say in the sense that I haven't developed any strong positions about it. But for example, I have a question: what does he mean by, capitalism has been replaced by the mafia? In what sense? What does he mean by? What do you think? How do you understand that, Michael?
Well, he didn't say
everybody else, of course.
He said the bourgeoisie.
The bourgeoisie, rather, has been replaced by the
mafia.
mafia.
Has been replaced, by the mafia. The class that becomes, operative in historical terms is now being swept away by a mafia-styled moment, right? Yeah.
Because if we go back to the argument that Fursev made, that I paraphrased, and the entire trajectory of capitalism is mafia-like social structures, closed crypto structures, closed structures that are immune, more or less, to the public limelight. Important decisions and key decisions are made almost exclusively outside of any kind of mass democratic accountability. They're just presented as fait accompli, So we can make the argument that the bourgeoisie has always functioned like a mafia. The entire trajectory of the British ruling class is one of piracy and criminal behavior, like in the most literal sense, right? Like the deployment of privateers as deputized, Navy part-time vessels in the process of primitive accumulation by robbing the Spanish gold-carrying, galleons from the North American continent, which was the primary form of initial accumulation of capital, and it's and preceded the further expansion of the British Empire on the shoulders of sheer piracy and mafia-like, the assassination of the Russian Tsar Peter I, for example, or Peter III, successor to Peter the Great, the use of political assassinations in kind of the most mafia-like, the stereotypical kind of stab in the back way. So, I think the entire trajectory of the bourgeoisie's style of politics, its distrust of the state, its distrust of any kind of universal, common to all, aspects of society. The liberals, the bourgeoisie has no use or no sense of the notion of a political community whatsoever. They just have the entire logic of any liberal, i.e. bourgeois politics, is this narrow, particular, close group that must cling to power as the condition of its own continued privileged existence. That's like the definition of the mafia, are like a pale comparison,
What about his comment, though, about proletarianization, that somehow the Soviet Union ultimately, if you will, went through this collapse or whatever? From his perspective, he's talking about it as proletarianization.
I would agree. I would agree with it if he's provided some kind of a specific date, because the Soviet Union, just like any other society, has several episodes of historical development which were radically different. So, for example, in my view, and I follow, I guess, a certain school of thought here, which is one of many, so this is clearly not a widely accepted view, but in my take, the history of Soviet history, the major landmarks were the initial revolutionary the initial coup, basically, the October counter coup, right? If we take that February 1917 was a liberal led revolution supported by external allies, primarily the British Empire, as a way of continuing the Russian stay in World War I, but also directly taking control of the Russian state through the liberal parties of the Duma or whatever. The October Revolution is the first watermark, and we can talk more about that later. The second watermark is the Stalinist victory in the internal civil war, which took place between the two main factions of the Bolshevik Party, right? One that was led by the internationalist wing, the Trotskyist kind of faction.
The left opposition, right?
The left opposition, which was a mirror image of the capitalist class in terms of its international orientation, anti-statist, etc. The Leninist function was a victory which was presided over by Stalin because Lenin had died at that point. Because Lenin himself started shifting away from this kind of, what I would say, irresponsible internationalism once he acquired state power, right? So Stalin's victory in 1937 against the attempted military coup and other internal factions marked the most radical stage of Soviet politics away from capitalism. And Keti Churkov, who's like a very interesting contemporary Russian philosopher, has written about this in a book that was published by the University of Minnesota Press a couple of years ago. She calls this the period of most radical de-alienation in Soviet society, where people were literally, and we can talk about what that means. So I think what Stiegler is referring to is the period of the 1960s, when after Stalin's death, there was this internal feud between the different factions. And after Khrushchev was removed, members of the elites came to power in the Soviet Union who did take a course of essentially rejoining the global capitalist, ruling elites, and to take their pie, take their privileged place as essentially liberals. And that trajectory took 20 years and terminated with the successful reestablishment of capitalism in the Soviet Union. So if he's talking about that stage, I agree with him totally, that was the state of the degeneration and the reintroduction of much more obvious kind of capitalist lines of management in the state enterprises, and even more importantly, of liberal political thought, which displaced Marxism in the universities, right? In the elite universities.
We could call it state bureaucratic capitalism in a certain way.
So the last 20 years, 25 years, I think, that's accurate. China faced a similar moment, I think, which was successfully handled in the Tiananmen Square events, which liberals are very traumatized by, because their political counter-revolutionary move was interrupted. So they couldn't have the double whammy. They couldn't have both the Soviet Union and China go back towards capitalism. They just succeeded with one, so I think in that sense.
Right, good. Okay, I think that puts it in. Chris, go ahead. You wanted to say something?
I was just asking about the name of the text.
I'm gonna tell you, Chris, in a second. I'm just gonna type it in because
I'm just gonna read a little bit more. I think Arto situates it nicely. I think Stiegler is not talking about the period from 1917 probably up till the middle 50s, until the de-Stalinization period, and then what takes hold in the 60s and the 70s. And, when we read Ilenkov later, probably one of the reasons for the suicide is that he saw, that this had been what it became, right? In some ways, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but it's
and if we use these frameworks of systemic versus structural, we can call it strategic crises. The 20th century had really one predominant counter capitalist or counter systemic threat on the global level, and that was the Soviet Union up until the 1960s, literally, or until Stalin's death, let's say, but maybe by inertia the couple of years after that. And formally until 1991, that was the only viable counter-systemic alternative. There were many other alternatives that were very on the tactical level of politics, on the level of everyday politics, which were extremely important. And millions of people around the world, autonomous movements, anarchist movements, kind of informal resistance movements to the practices of everyday life under capitalism, but none of those were able to displace the systemic kind of oppression that capitalist logic, right? So there was only one systemic alternative, and the destruction of that systemic alternative allowed capitalism, gave it a breather of another 20 years until now, before it confronts its current crisis, right? So in other words, it was a very important 20 to 30 year kind of delay of its own structural crisis, which now everybody is writing about, including like the Financial Times, which is expressed through a seemingly unending chains of wars, getting closer and closer to World War III and thermonuclear war, the threat of at least, right? Today, the Russian military conducted an unprecedented strategic nuclear strike exercise. I mean, it's extremely ominous sounding. They launched 3 nuclear ballistic missiles simultaneously, basically practicing for full-blown, nuclear war as a warning, as let's put the brakes on, So I think we're at that stage now. So I think if he was talking about the last 20 years, it makes sense. But but the way he writes about it doesn't show an understanding of the systemic versus structural distinction that the Soviet system. I mean, think about the anti-colonial movements. Think about the trajectory of the entire. Think about the IRA fighting in Ireland against the British imperialists. I mean, these were supported by Colonel Gaddafi, as we know, with fishing boats. But where did Colonel Gaddafi obtain the weapons? He obtained it ultimately from the Soviet Union. So, in other words, struggles as disparate as the IRA's, self-defense in Northern Ireland in the 60s and 70s. Then we go to Mozambique and Angola, anti-apartheid struggles. Then we talk about the evacuation of political prisoners in Chile. I mean, that's an incredible movie. There are many movies made about this in Russia, in Bulgarian too. When the Chile coup, the fascists under Pinochet successfully overthrew the Allende government, there was mass executions, as we all know. But there were a lot of people who were saved. And how were they saved? Those people who couldn't escape on their own to Mexico or elsewhere. A lot of those people were saved by the Stasi, the East German secret police, because they had a system where their embassy vehicles, their embassy cars had secret compartments in the trunk, and people were Chilean, activists, socialists, anti-junta, opponents were literally smuggled by the Stasi secret service because they had diplomatic immunity from the country. The same thing applied for the Soviet secret police and associated allies. Same thing applies for political prisoners in Argentina who were smuggled, to Czechoslovakia, for example. All this history is sort of like purposeful.
It's a very great point, because it talks about who gets away to tell the story and how this is facilitated, as you say, by Stasi. Stasi is
Stasi was not
word to most people.
Yeah, Stasi was like nightmare.
Absolutely crucial to that moment, and as you said, in Chile and other places too, Argentina as well.
I mean, if we talk about Stasi and we think, we see the movies that made about them, dark skies, gloomy, like smoke permeating the city, fog, dark shapes with weapons, and but Stasi played a premier role in saving countless political prisoners from execution and torture, and the question, of course, leads not to get sidetracked, but there's a train of thought in Germany among German Marxists and German communists, but not only East German, that the unification of Germany was not supposed to be the Anschluss of East Germany. It was not supposed to coincide with the destruction of the East German state. That wasn't part of the deal. So when East Germany reunited with West Germany, it wasn't supposed to be just the Federal Republic of Germany swallowing East Germany. There was supposed to be the coexistence of the two Germanys. Right. So there's all kinds of, which, by the way, is a direct echo of the war between NATO and Russia today, because that's part of the Russian government's complaint, is that NATO's expansion also included the destruction of East Germany, which changed everything, because that basically made Germany the biggest country in Europe, outside of,
So just to go back to Stiegler for a second, I think the way he's framing it is that he's seeing two things happening simultaneously, let's say in the 50s and the 60s. On the one hand, he sees the renunciation of the struggle against proletarianization, and on the other hand, the use of the Bernays propaganda, the marketing, etc., that goes on in the West. And I think he's trying to put the two together to think about, the Simondonian problematic of the psychic and the collective individuation that is lost in that both produced a kind of ultimately a loss of individuation. And if I could just read down in a second, on page 61, the capitalist economy, strictly speaking, no longer works because it wants the psychic individual to be self-directed, to become the entrepreneur of itself. And Chris, if you remember, and Kristen wasn't, anyway, Chris and Josh is not here, but Chiarina, when she talked about the entrepreneurial self that emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union, how much that became important to us. Without collective individuation, this whole notion that it was psychic individuation gone amok into basically this self-reliance, entrepreneur of itself, but rather through a collective disindividuation orchestrated by marketing, which exploits the possibility of control emanating from the provoking of short circuits. And since the conservative revolution, and we're in this sense, we're not talking Germany 1920s or 30s. We're talking about, because he puts it in quotation marks, we're obviously talking about the neocon, the Reagan Revolution, obviously. And then the neoliberalism and the project of refounding MEDEF, which amounts to the French translation of neoliberalism, through a government of inequalities which ruins the social, right? All of which destroys the economic milieu itself, and thereby becomes, and he uses this term, dis-economy, and this to me is interesting, heading back to the liquidation of intermediation, which is the translation of transindividuation into the economic sphere in its commercial form. Anyway, so this is very interesting. And then he goes into the Marcusian notion of desublimation, which thus leads, and in the same time movement, to the spread of negative externalities, the liquidation of commerce by the market and destructiveness. And I think this fits somewhat with Homo Datum and socialized cybernetics for you, Arto. The destruction of social connectedness can be translated that the bourgeoisie is swept away by the mafia. This is the first time he uses this phrase in the section, which is the fate befalling the former communist countries, but also of all drive-based capitalism. So he is part of that school, I guess, that sees after the fall that somehow a mafia, emerged, right, during the shock therapy, et cetera, of Russia, right? This is no news to us, but how he uses it, it's kind of interesting to my mind. The media tends to replace mafia tends to replace the bourgeoisie, and capitalism takes on an essentially mafia-like character. But as you pointed out already, it was mafia from the beginning. All you have to do is read Machiavelli in 1513 to get the idea of how this operates, right? And from the moment that the disenchantment of the world is completed. So this is interesting, though, how this notion of Weber, the disenchantment of the world, which Stiegler, plays with in another book, The Reenchantment of the World, happens at the end of this cycle of the bourgeois control of capital into this new mafia. The disenchantment becomes no longer relative, but absolute, because there no longer be any relative reenchantment. For example, the advent of modern art, rejecting the industrial art, and he talks about Flaubert, both within and for bourgeois modernity. When disenchantment becomes absolute, the power of the powerful plays out without and I think this is why he uses mafia, without consistence, without relation to odium of any kind, without the slightest belief, and therefore is absolute cynicism, which neither faith nor law. And this may, I think a way he's given us again another diagnostic here, absolute cynicism, right? In a sense. So it is within the epoch of mafia capitalism, that is the capitalism without bourgeoisie, that's what he means by mafia, that one sees the development, the systematic state lie, drive-based politics and an addictive consumerism induced by industrial populism. Right? Some way. If fascism is a disease of bourgeois capitalism, the occurrence of which is a warning sign foreshadowing absolute disenchantment, then the becoming mafia of capitalism is not an accident, which would be more or less epiphenomenal. Rather, it is the normal and everyday functioning of such a capitalism. Right? In this respect, Sarkozianism is not, unfortunately, if one can put it like this, a return of Patainism. It is something far more serious, more complex, and more difficult to think than the return of the old same song. So I think he's trying to be as contemporary as possible. Ultimately, he talks about, we talk about surplus value, we talk about fictional, fictitious capital, but we really don't speak about this switch to speculative capital, which has no base at all. Right? No base at all. Yeah, at this point. Yeah, in a sense. So I don't know if you want to, speak to this a little bit, and then we can go on to Homo Datum. But I find this chapter interesting in some ways he's trying to really look at this, thorough capitalism. We've talked a little bit about this among our group, about how it used to be the Arm and Hammer, who was a complete criminal, in a sense, but he had access to the Kremlin, friend to Lenin. He brought drugs in when they needed it into Russia, etc. And he would build foundations. He was an art collector. He was a man who had some sense. Even Soros, in a sense, a book collector, a PhD in philosophy, etc. Today, we have none of this, right, anymore with these people, right? Yeah.
Well, it seems like the bourgeoisie is also proletarianized. I think that's
yes,
kind of the
it's
point.
a very
right,
interesting point. Yes, exactly.
In other words, the bourgeoisie itself is losing
right.
Touch with its own historical memory and its own skill set, if you will.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what Stiegler is saying, right, Michael? I mean,
yes, no,
which
I
is
agree.
a provocative
I agree
idea.
completely. Yeah. And I think that's what he means in this transformation from bourgeois, swept away by the mafia, which couldn't care less, right?
Right. It's the difference between, like you said, like even somebody like Soros or Armand Hammer or whatever, a capitalist who has fine, appreciation of literature or is a sponsor of the opera in a genuine way because they really, love going to the opera, and they have court musicians, and they're movie producers because they like this incredible filmmaker and what she does.
Right.
Versus the Zuckerbergs, the dude bro kind of billionaires who are essentially, there's nothing interesting there, in the way they speak.
I agree.
They have no ideas beyond the most kind of basic, banal kind of, I don't know, third year undergraduate, like dorm room conversation, which somehow it worked out for them in terms of the accumulation of wealth, but in terms of like systemic or structural strategic thinking, I don't know if they're capable of that compared to like people like, I don't know, Carnegie or something, or
yes, and right? Think about the jazz world, for example. Where would it be without a Rothschild and a Guggenheim?
Right.
Yeah, the Rothschild.
So the crisis of the bourgeoisie.
Thelonious Monk, among others. I can go through the whole list. And Peggy Guggenheim, Art Blakey, the Jazz Messengers, et cetera, et cetera. These were people that were really in the old sense of bourgeois patronage. Not that this was a great, but they had that sense of the culture mattered, right? Or the furtherance of that kind of culture. There was still a sense of the avant-garde. And I think he's also looking at this. He doesn't mention, he mentioned modern art once, but yeah, where would it be? Yeah, without, yeah. And what is who are the museums name? Look at the museum name in New York City, the Guggenheim. Nothing but. You talk about mafia and Chile. Neruda wrote the poem Anaconda, about the Anaconda Copper Company, right? In a sense. So we have that, but in a way it became cultural, et cetera. Chris, what's your question? I'm sorry, I'm not reading the chat.
I think this is very interesting. I'm sort of trying to frame out culture as an ideological mechanism, because I don't know, even sort of like the high culture of this sort of era, probably in its being funded or promoted by these bourgeois people probably has some ideological motive or like ideological end to it. Maybe not like all like, you know,
Well, I'll let Arto take that. I mean, I have my thoughts, but Arto, I'm sure has some
I don't know. I
ideas.
mean, it's a good question. I think
Yeah.
I think in that period, bourgeois high culture or bourgeois sponsored culture, I think was until they faced deliberate resistance against them, it was really a way to highlight kind of like the leadership roles, if you will, of the bourgeoisie, the elite. The elite is the aristocratic, is sort of like the aristocratic sensibility. The elite are those who drive society forward in all of its facets, not just as captains of industry, but also as captains of culture. They're the conditions of possibility for culture to emerge. This is like the classic liberal notion. This is, you know, Beethoven being sponsored by the local prince, that Beethoven, as a good radical democratic Republican, turned his back to the local prince. It says Beethoven does art for himself, not
Simon, thank you.
because of you know, serving the bourgeois, you know, for money. But a lot of artists did, because that was a way to make a living. So I think one of the ways we can read counter-systemic Marxist-based, you know, communist revolutionary politics is the democratization of culture and the deliberate ways to make the products of human culture defined as the totality of not just literature and the arts and music, but also all of the ways that made life well lived. I think the democratized culture was the primary point of all revolutionary movements that managed to wield power. At least that was their stated goal, including in the Soviet Union. And of course, we can think of Bertolt Brecht here, for example, or the entire kind of 1920s through the 1930s line of the kind of revolutionary avant-garde in the arts. The whole point was, you know, Mayakovsky read his poems to thousands of workers in a factory. You know, he did not want to read his poem only in the theater, right? In front of like the bourgeois of the 1914 or in the literary salons before the revolution. The point was, you have to, every human being, and this of course connects to the fundamental political question, what does it mean to be human as your starting point for your politics? Counter-capitalist, you know, socialist politics work on the premise that culture is accessible to all human beings. You know, culture meaning the ability to read, to appreciate literature, music, and arts, but also any other meaningful and important product of human labor and human sustained human effort. Science. Everybody can understand Einstein's theory of relativity, not just those who go to the elite schools in Connecticut, the boarding schools. Everybody has the capacity to understand, you know, quantum mechanics on a conceptual level. Not everybody has to be a physicist, right? Just like everybody can develop an appreciation of, you know, jazz, not just those, you know, who or the opera. You know, you don't have to drive a Mercedes S-Class in order to understand culture, because you had that kind of education in Ivy League school. So I think the cultural battle is just another front in the political battle overall between capitalist societies or the capitalist class and its counter elites, you know, which come from.
I mean, the interesting thing is we no longer have museum without walls. You have to pay a fortune to join, you know, get your memberships. It's not as open as it used to be to go hear, you know, some of the better jazz musicians. It's going to hit you for $40, $50 cover charges. You know, all these things are now, in a way, have been commodified and monetized in a way that has made it inaccessible to a lot of people. So you get certain people like William Parker in jazz. I don't know if you guys know the bassist, but he has excellent projects, political thinking, you know, going on. And they try to make it as public as possible, right? They make their money sometimes in the club or, you know, teaching, etc. But they want to get a much greater audience. So they do this in terms of open concerts. So this is something that's interesting in a way, but this is slowly disappearing. slowly disappearing. This kind of outreach in a sense. You had the Living Theater with Julian Beck and Judith Malina in New York City, which was a political theater that was really the theater without walls, right? In many ways, the theater without a stage, really out there, really guerrilla theater. So what happens, in this moment that now, just to go to an off-Broadway play is restricted to those that are making in New York City at least 6 figures or better, right? To go to this. So this is being withheld in a sense. So what happens, at least in my mind, is a lot of this libidinal energy is transformed into activism and demonstrations on the street. Right? It becomes part of a protest movement without the cultural front alongside it. This is the I think part of the problem that you did have back with the Living Theater or Grotowski's Poor Theater, Artaud's Theater of Cruelty, all these moments that were really actually taking apart the Aristotelian notion of theater, in a sense, the old traditional classical values, just like Brecht did, because Brecht, like Eisenstein, wrote theory about the theater, the alienation effect, of course, being one of his famous, ploys in the theater to make the audience feel much more objective, right, rather than identification with characters, etc., and purification or cathartic energies. Yeah. So I think this is very important to see in part of this absolute cynicism that people, that has been reduced. I mean, I like this concept because, I talk to a lot of friends, who grew up during the 60s, if you will, and they just turned into absolute cynics. Everything, it's like, the conversation is, oh, guess who was elected to the House of Representatives? Stefanik called him a legal titan because he wrote the text that, for Trump's defense and all this, and et cetera. So all of this is kind of like, in a sense, I think Stiegler is looking at this in terms of that we're at this absolute moment of the disenchanted world. And, one way, again, I'm trying to look at this through the pharmakon. That's the poison that we've gotten to, if you will, or the diagnostic, if you will. And the prescriptive, in a sense, is to kind of this re-enchantment through a kind of, new set of symbols. And as you pointed out, Arto, the cultural front, in a sense. Yeah.
Well, there's an interesting sentence that where you stop reading, Michael, on page 63 on the bottom of the page.
Sure,
right?
good.
He says, the middle classes will soon disappear.
Yes.
Because they've been proletarianized by the development of consumerism. Now, we know in the intellectual and political history of Marxism that the middle classes were always anticipated to disappear because the middle class or the bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, the small shopkeepers and etc., they were leftovers from pre-capitalist social classes. Right. So we know, if we're convinced by Marx's analysis in the Communist Manifesto and elsewhere, that the middle classes are going to disappear. The shopkeeper is going to become extinct. Well, we already see this, obviously, empirically in every capitalist country, but especially in the United States. What's happening to small businesses? They're basically disappearing almost everywhere, and replaced increasingly with fake small businesses like franchises that are essentially chunks of large capitalist enterprises. And then he says, this is not to say that the middle classes have been pauperized or impoverished totally, right? The former is not the consequence of the latter. It is to say that the middle classes are no longer any kind of petty bourgeoisie, not because they've been pauperized, impoverished, but through a symbolic misery, symbolic impoverishment, and through an aesthetic impoverishment. So see, that's the thing. I think capitalism, unless it was facing a systemic threat to its existence, like it did between 1917 and 1991, and potentially today again, will never pay attention to to promoting aesthetic value for society in general, for all the social classes existing in society. In fact, it will dismiss it because it doesn't have that kind of a sensibility. Because capitalism is a political structure ruled by money changers, large-scale merchants and large-scale commodity producers. These are not people who have the fantasy by default, if they're left to their own devices, who have the internal urge to develop a refined sense of aesthetics as something that's very important to their lives. With few exceptions, I'm talking about this class generalization, right? These are people who are attuned to pathetic, simplistic accounting tricks and basically mafia-like hustles to undo the competition and or the state or their political and economic opponents, unless they're facing a systemic opposition which emphasizes the aesthetic dimension of human life, the ethical dimension of human life, and the fundamental question of living a good life, a well-developed life for all people in society. That was the communist project, literally, in October 1917 onwards until 1990. Even in its most bureaucratized and kind of degenerated parts in the 1980s, that was still the basic premise, because you could always go back to that and reactivate that energy that was publicly proclaimed to be your politics, right? Once that disappeared, within 20 years, we're back to what capitalism really was before the October Revolution. Obviously not the same way, because we can never replicate past periods, but we're living through a period of what capitalist essence is, which is generalized misery, generalized mediocrity, and generalized miseration in every field of life, right? So why? Because this is what left themselves without any real systemic opposition. This is what the capitalist class, that's all that it can do. It can basically accumulate profits for itself through a brutal hold on power globally, but it has no other need nor desire to cultivate the other dimensions of human life. And as a result, you have concentration camp-like existence, right, on a global scale. Now, sometimes the camps are nicer in some places than others, but that's basically all it has to offer. And I think that's what Stiegler is really saying here, right? He's basically saying, I mean, when he's using these strong terms like symbolic misery, I mean, the symbolic is like part of the mind, right? So thinking is a highly developed exercise or ability or predisposition or a way of making sense of the world through all the different mechanisms of symbol manipulation, abstract thought, the movement from the abstract to the concrete when applied to a particular concrete task in a person's life. All these things are impoverished. They're proletarianized. They're lost. They're forgotten. They're underdeveloped. So this is we can read Stiegler, I think, and I think this is what, Michael, you've been doing. We can read Stiegler as a radical, making a radical statement about capitalist politics, which is capitalism's got nothing to offer. I mean, it's not a new argument, but it's new in the context of our time. Capitalism has nothing to offer. It's a mediocre, useless, harmful, impoverished ideology and a practice. And it must be destroyed. It must be overcome so we can finally take a breather, and maybe humanity can enter another upward spiral of a period of thriving and developing, and et cetera. So I think that's, I mean, to me, that's what Stiegler is.
I mean, again, the reading of Stiegler is kind of, to my mind, a kind of updating, if you will, a kind of contemporary version of where we really are, at this point. He's taking into account, again, as most people here know, there was always this attempted tendency since Marcuse, and maybe a little bit before, but really Marcuse was the one who tried to mix, if you will, the libidinal economy with the economy, right? With political economy, right? And the libidinal economy and political economy are always working side by side. I think Stiegler is trying to take that now into another dimension. He's trying to build that up into, something that is, 70 years after Eros and civilization, to try to bring this back into the discussions. It's not only about exploitation of labor. It's not only about the creation of surplus value. It's not only about, the return to, other days or searching out alternatives. He's really trying to look at this in the contemporary light of where we really are, right? In this sense. And as you say, the symbolic, his term, he wrote a book on symbolic misery, right? And et cetera, and how that miseration takes place, because no longer, if you don't know how to make, you don't know how to understand symbols. You don't understand how symbols are made. And you see this more and more. I mean, basically, I know I've said this before, it's frightening to me. I mean, at second and third tier institutions, people don't know how to read. This is at university level. They're reading at a 6th to 8th grade level at this point.
And
So
there's an interesting question here, Michael, sorry, which is, how does it happen that somebody, a person who goes through 12 years of formal schooling daily, right, passes through all of the check marks and progresses through the grades, can arrive at age 18 or 19 unable to read, to be functionally illiterate in any parts of the world, is what I'm saying, right? How is that possible that after 12 years of formal schooling, someone in the 21st century can be functionally illiterate at age 22 after all of those years of schooling, where no matter what happened in the room, it must have happened through osmosis, right?
Yeah.
That's incredible. That's an incredible technology of oppression.
I had a student that dropped out.
When you force people to go to school for 12 years, you graduate them and they're functionally illiterate, and then you allow them into college where it's very difficult to almost impossible for them to even realize that they're functionally illiterate. And then you're okay with that on a societal level and you reproduce it. That must be difficult to do. That kind of a crime against humanity.
It is a crime against humanity.
I mean, that's monstrous crime.
Are crimes against humanity. Really, in a different way. Really, you can broaden the concept to talking about the administrative class that has taken over the universities. Yeah.
Or even the mechanics of how that's done.
The universities.
The mechanics of how you foster systemic illiteracy and unawareness of certain fundamental things. Like, for example, we have this horrible pandemic that's going through the world right now, even though people in important places pretend like it's not happening. And of course, Beth like has studied this and lived this, on a much closer level. And so Beth, please jump in whenever you feel like, I'm saying something outrageous and inaccurate, but we are living through this pandemic, and the disorientation that exists throughout the world. How do people orient themselves to separate, scientifically believable or facts that should be believed and acted upon from the lunatic ideas that are on the level of the earth is flat, which millions of people are buying because of this inability to have this, this ability to filter out by reading and thinking and speaking and watching complete nonsense from things that are logically traceable, has devastating results. And I'm sure millions of people have died or have been very badly hurt because of this kind of proletarianization, right? Which affects the ability to think and make sense of everything, including the ability to read scientific papers or not have the ability to basically read scientific papers in a way that can make somebody make an accurate interpretation of it and then act accordingly. And that could have devastating results for people's lives physically, right?
Yeah, and this will play out better when we read Free to Obey, because really that's the culture that we're living in. Everybody thinks they're free, but basically complete obedience and subservience to what is, right? What they're told.
And it's like, how did we get here?
It's no longer the Milgram experiments. It's something that is done digitally. You don't need Stanley Milgram anymore to show, pain thresholds and obedience to authority. This goes without saying now. They didn't even need to run an experiment on this. This is what the digital pharmakon, has done, and the digitalization of everyday life, to push buttons to obey. And you also, another question that has to be raised is this inability of people to ask questions. to ask questions rigorously. They just want simple answers, A, B, C, D, right, etc. And there's no ability to ask a question rigorously at all.
So
None.
this is, I think, an important, very important point, Michael, because in all of our seminars, I think we do the same thing instinctively, or maybe by following, by standing on the shoulders of giants and thinkers
we're the dwarfs,
who teach us this, which is, and I think, I mean, me and you are teachers, and we teach at the university, and I'm sure a lot of people with us today, and we've all been to school, but I think in terms of at least university education, but also basic education, I think we've forgotten, and maybe this is because teachers themselves and professors have been proletarianized, or intellectuals and intellectual workers have been proletarianized too. We're not immune from this, obviously. And is what is the method of inquiry, or what is one way to conduct inquiry in the sciences, in the humanities, in any field of human study? And of course, one of the ways to do it is, if not one of the predominant ways, is to accurately formulate a question that is relevant to your intended field of study. So when we study something, we must be able to formulate the fundamental questions that seem directly necessary to be confronted, and in our attempt to answer them, we're going to move closer to learning about what we seek to learn, or to reduce our ignorance of that question which has confronted us, right? So to be able to ask a question which is the grounding of your inquiry is like a fundamental skill. But in my experience, I'm witnessing that that's not being taught, right? So in other words, I'm talking about schooling now, but this applies outside of school as well. It's like, if you try to understand something about the COVID pandemic, it helps to begin to understand it helps to begin by formulating questions that are directly necessary and relevant. They need to be asked in order to answer the fundamental, to get to the answer, like, what is COVID? How should we confront it? What is happening now? So I think the same applies to politics, like the political crisis, and like, what are the political questions that we need to ask today to get out of the crisis? The crisis being the generalized proletarianization of capitalist societies, including of the capitalist class itself, and the devastating consequences that follow from generalized proletarianized society, And it seems like Stiegler is doing that. But if we were to ask those questions today ourselves, like, if we assume that there's a political crisis that we're facing today, like in the United States or in Europe or in the world, what are, how do we wrap our heads around that? Like, how can we understand this political crisis, or the dimensions of this political crisis? So we have to start by searching for these fundamental questions that are going to ground our inquiry, our line of study, and all of the fundamental thinkers that have shaped human history have done that, right? So our friend Heidegger, right, spends 50 or 55 pages, as Michael would say.
He was a bad man. I wouldn't call him a friend, but
55 pages in the beginning of his book, Being in Time, just wrestling with himself publicly on those pages, with arriving at the fundamental question that's going to guide the rest of his inquiry. And by doing that, he's modeling how we should do that too, or one way of doing that, right? Lenin, politically, what is to be done?
Right.
Or Lenin's first systematic study, what is the nature of capitalism in Russia? Question mark. It's a question, right? But by answering that question, you understand what type of political organizational forms are going to be necessary that don't exist yet in order for you to be effective politically in changing that society towards the society that you believe in.
Going back to your method idea, that the search for a method, or the need for a method today, I mean, in some ways, you're very much talking about Marx's method. The method of research is different from the method of presentation. And, we're really in this moment of asking the questions, right? We're in that method of research so that we can get to the presentation in this movement from very abstract questions back to the concrete, again.
Yeah.
And, and in period of generalized proletarianization, it is very hard for students to follow the abstract, to the concrete. Very,
and also whether it's in university or in intellectual life in general or in political life, there's always this thing: what is your argument? In other words, what are your answers? What is your position about this particular issue? Well, that's the arrival station. That's where you have to arrive at. But how do you get to your argument is nobody cares about. Like,
very great point.
Give me your argument. Well, I don't have an argument. Like, for example, in this little outline on Homo Datum, I have no arguments really that are well shaped because I don't know, I don't have them. But hopefully there are questions there which at some point, if they're pursued, if they're interesting, if they're useful, they should produce some arguments. But you need the question before you arrive at a relevant argument. So I think everything is completely proletarianized, even in the way we conduct intellectual discourse.
What's your argument is always the question. What's your argument? Etc.
It's like, I don't have an argument. And I'm like, well, then I shouldn't listen to you.
How do we ask the question radically different? Which is something that we've certainly learned both from Heidegger and from Lenin, as you said, both in the activity and in terms of asking questions about.
So my proposal is, if we agree that our starting point, if we choose our starting point being, are we in a situation of political crisis globally, and are things going badly? Like, are things happening that are really making our lives difficult and kind of dangerously so, for reasons that seem to be in need of change? I think one question that we can try to ask in order to make sense of the political crisis that exists today in the world, one question is probably, and the easiest question to ask would be the oldest question in the history of politics, which is the question that was already asked and suggested to us as a good question to ask when we confront crisis, is Aristotle's question. I mean, there are others, I'm sure, in ancient philosophy as well, but I'm using Aristotle because I'm familiar with him. And Aristotle says the fundamental political question always is, what does it mean to be human? How our politics are defining the question of who we are. Because in asking that question, what does it mean to be human? In answering that question, we will touch on the entire field of human history, philosophy, sociology, thinking, and etc. What does it mean to be human? Well, how do we answer that question? There are many ways to answer that question. So what could be one answer? What does it mean to be human? I mean, what would you say? Who wants to answer that question directly, right? I mean, sort of as like a kind of a improvised, question. Well, on one level, it could mean, what does it mean to be human? What is the, what are some of them, how do I live life? And the immediate answer to that follow-on question might be, well, clearly humans are social animals, which Aristotle said. We cannot achieve self-sufficiency, which means we cannot achieve a satisfying existence as human beings alone. So the liberal argument is destroyed right there. 2000 years before liberal philosophers like John Locke came up with this pathetic argument about the individual, discovering the acorns or the apples in the forest, and et cetera, and the radical individualism of liberal, or i.e. capitalist politics, because liberalism is the political philosophy of capitalism. 2000 years before that, Aristotle said, if somebody says that, they're either non-humans or they're gods, which sounds a little bit ominous, because I think some of these imperialists think of themselves as gods or superhumans, but in that sense. But Aristotle would say the political community is the fundamental basic cell of all meaningful human life. Humans live life through meaning and aspiring to live a good life, a fulfilling life where all of the different parts of their humanity are functioning well. And he gives the analogy with the human body. If your left arm is suffering from gangrene, there's no way you're going to live well. There's no way that body is going to be functioning the way it's meant to be, because you're meant to have two arms, right, that are functioning in a healthy way. If the left arm is suffering from gangrene, there's no way you're going to be functioning optimally, medically speaking. So then we have this basic analogy. What does it mean to be human? To be human means, and of course, here we're entering immediately the Marxist tradition, because Marx got this from Aristotle, because he considered Aristotle very insightful on this, as we know. Human beings, what does it mean to be human? Well, there's certain needs that need to be met for people to thrive, to live well. And one of those things is to have, expressed maybe in a latter day language of 20th century, early 20th century philosophy, but also Marx and etc., the fully developed human being is the basic cell of the political life. That's the goal. We want to live in a society where members of society are socialized in such a way that they're fully developed human beings. They're not like the Soviet philosopher Ilenkov, who we're going to read later, I hope, a little bit. He said the purpose of post-capitalist society, the purpose of a contra-capitalist society, the purpose of a communist society, the purpose of a democratic society in the real sense of the word, is for people to grow up in that society where before they're asked, are you a good mechanic, or are you a good doctor or a good nurse? Are you a bus driver? They think of themselves as human beings, right? So before the economic function that you play in society, which is what all capitalism allows us to think of ourselves, we strictly encourage to think of ourselves as agents of material production, of commodity production, right? And our entire lives are spent through the categories of capitalist economic structures. Are you advancing at work? Are you up with your mortgage payments? Are you not late with your credit card payments? Do you have did you upgrade your car? So all of the logic of everyday existence, as we know, is seen through the lens of capitalist economic accounting structures and management structures and et cetera, and finance structures, interest kind of accumulation. There's another way to answer the question, what does it mean to be human, which is a human being is a being of which the economic reasoning is but one part of our daily life. Yes, Mike.
I was just going to mention, in some ways, the Aristotelian definition of, man is a political animal above all. He used politon zoa, political animal is the Greek term. Really what capital requires at this point is a depoliticized animal, and which I think fits very much with what you're saying, that this all the moves of the past 30 years, and even probably throughout the history of capitalism as a system, has been to depoliticize. And the greatest we see of this, of course, is in the United States, because conflict zones in the United States are very well controlled, right? It can be controlled by social media, et cetera. The United States has never been through a loss, me being from the South, there's the feeling of the loss in the Civil War, and maybe give the edge to Southern literature and Southern thinking. But other than that, the United States has never meant defeat. So there's no need for the political animal, and depoliticization is operative at every level. I remember a good friend, Greg Sims, he came from Australia, Beryl. He came to study at Johns Hopkins, study Lacan. He translated the Francois Roustan books on Lacan. And he came in and he was asked, what does he think of the politics in the United States? He said, what politics? In a sense. And this is very interesting, in terms of where we really are. How is it possible, and Beth knows this as well as anybody, how is it possible that we have this massive censorship where intellectuals cannot speak their mind in an academic free zone, and that everybody is petrified of 2 or 3 Israeli organizations, right, in the United States that have been taken over, for a very long time, since the Jewish Holocaust, etc. Why, how have we gotten to that point where we no longer even have a place and an exchange of ideas? And what does that mean in terms of the public, that there is a complete outrage about this? In terms of real things. I had 3 Palestinian students that came to my office. Can we do an independent study with you? because they heard I dared to broach the subject in the classroom. They heard through other classes, and that someone was traumatized and walked out. They couldn't take it. So, mate, I said, oh, I'm glad they're trying, but she came back and apologized because the students are so conditioned that they think they're going to get a bad grade if they don't please the professor, instead of getting into a, some kind of polemic or engagement. So it's really, I think in a way you have in your work, Arto, in a way, we're talking through Stiegler and actually what you point out here about socialized cybernetics. We have this kind of contra Aristotle and Marx, right? In some ways, that the political animal is completely depoliticized, and this makes it possible. And the only forms we have is no longer cultural forms, very little cultural forms. The forms are on the streets, protest and resistance, right? In a sense, right? This is it, and nothing further.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow exactly what you said, Michael, and I think if one of the questions through which we might study the contemporary or make sense of the contemporary political crisis is what does it mean to be human? If the answer is what does it mean to be human is to live in a society of fully developed human beings, fully developed in the sense of what the word suggests, a human being who is exercised because they've lived in an environment where that's been encouraged. They've exercised all the multiple dimensions of interests, of predispositions, of skills, of abilities, of activities, right? That's one answer. That's one political ideology or political project that emerges from that kind of definition of what does it mean to be human and to live as such. The other answer is, which is the predominant one today, which is what does it mean to be human? The other answer is, well, it means to be an educated consumer, or it means to be an informed citizen, meaning you vote every 4 years or every 2 years, and then you turn off from politics, except you donate your check to your favorite organization.
Who's less evil than the other? Who am I voting for?
But I think there's a third possibility that's emerging, a third answer that's emerging to the question, what does it mean to be human? And that is I feel as a hypothesis, but I have no proof yet, but I feel that's the answer of cyberneticians in the West. And the answer is, what does it mean to be human is an irrelevant question, because the human being is the problem. Humans are flawed. I'm paraphrasing some of the early cyberneticians in their speeches they made in the early conferences. A lot of them are British, by the way, connected to the imperial state, of course. It's the human animal itself that is flawed, banal, boring, irrational, prone to emotional kind of overdependence. So politics really should not place human beings defined in the Aristotelian sense in the front place. In fact, it should ignore the question as essentially at this point irrelevant. The point is to transcend humans and to improve them, rather than improve them through human-devised technological means, meaning which means using a logic that is different from the logic of Aristotle. It's not dialectical logic which assumes that contradictions in our lives will emerge constantly, and the overcoming of contradictions is not only possible, it's the best way to live a meaningful life. That logic is replaced by simplistic mathematical formal logic, which avoids contradictions like the plague, because they're error conditions as they're applied in cybernetics. They're error conditions because the machinery, they're logical flaws, which must be sidestepped or avoided from the get-go, right? And so in the sense that third answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? That question is no longer interesting. That's no longer of primary importance, because we've deemed humans already after the horrors of the 20th century, which is what these cyberneticians said in the 50s. They said after the killing fields of World War II and the genocides of World War II, it is clear that people are flawed, horrible little creatures that are irrational. They're in all these categories of the good life, the fully developed life, and etc. These are meaningless things, because these are primitive creatures that need to be controlled for their own benefit. as if the 20th century contained the only genocides of human history, right? I mean, these early cyberneticians, which we're going to encounter, are incredibly politically illiterate people. They have absolutely no understanding, or at least in their public statements, of, for example, the genocides of the 19th century around the world, or the killing fields of the 16th century, for example, across Europe or across, what became known as North America, or, Mesoamerica, and etc. So I think the question, what does it mean to be human? We are living through a period where that question increasingly in the capitalist class is not only dismissed, but the formulation of that question is seen as the problem. And I think that's a big problem. I think that's at the core of the political crisis of today, when the capitalist class itself has abandoned its own liberal roots, even, which is already a degeneration compared to Aristotelian thought about politics, of which Marxism is a development. So already we're facing a degeneration in thinking about politics, which has taken the question of what does it mean to be human, and instead of trying to answer it in the most complex way, in the most concrete way possible, they're basically saying, we got to throw that question out. The human being, as defined by Aristotle, but also by the most insightful members of the European Enlightenment, if we stay within that framework, because that's the framework of capitalists' genealogy, they've thrown out the Enlightenment too. And instead we have, as we can talk about once we start reading the cybernetician speeches, we're looking at a worldview that is powered by a form of logic that is very, very inapplicable, I think, to making sense of human life, which is formal mathematical logic applied to human social relations.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think one great example on the contemporary scene, if I could just add to this, is again going back to this repression of academic freedom and the ability to speak. Because what ultimately is happening is contradictions are being completely avoided, right? There's absolutely no thinking in contradictions. It really is an incessant kind of propagandization that's going on with positivity on every point. And of course, propaganda that accompanies punishment too. It's kind of like the fear of punishment that's going on. It's a new administration of fear that's happening. And I think this is very, very important and very frightening to think about, because the intelligentsia, and as Chomsky said, 95% of the intellectuals are clerks to the system, but that other 5% are not being heard. That other, 5 to 10% are not being heard. And, the contradictions are not allowed to be out in the media, or they're so milquetoast, they're so watered down, so banal on the dominant media that they have no meaning at all, right? In a sense. So I think you raise a great point. And really what happens is the propaganda and the apparatus that is producing this on multiple levels, the frameworks on which it's operating, produce a kind of new mathematization, right, of the automated society. That's what's really going on here, in a sense. There's no critique, that's really possible. Yeah. And
no, I totally.
The most frightening aspect of all of this that's happening before our eyes. What you call human beings, biological beings with human capacities, right? Or the human being, as the Chicago School defined it. The human being for Becker is human capital, not human beingness. It's human capital. You are capital. That's all. That's
and
it.
we should, and Michael, following basically this exposition, which gives examples of what are the consequences when the fundamental or the dominant sense-making apparatus of our society is structured using a logic that's insufficiently sophisticated to capture the complexities of human life, or what, Michael, you just listed. And if we could spend a second on Becker, the University of Chicago Nobel Prize-winning economist, who developed the concept of human capital, as Michael said, which Michel Foucault engages with. You're right. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human is a human being is somebody who has capital in their own being through their ability to work. What a primitive reductionnist move to reduce human intellectual dispositions and capacities, human psychosocial, psycholinguistic, the kind of like the beautiful inherent vagueness of the human language and its use, to reduce all of these things to the simplistic economic dimension of value production. Yes. And that's all a human is. In other words, when Becker and all of his influential students argued this in the 1970s, especially in the 1980s, it basically answered this question: what does it mean to be human? For an entire generation of American politicians and policymakers and professors and people, right? What does it mean to be human? Basically, a human being means just go to work, do your job, or find new ways to make money. It's the same old story, of course, but packaged in with renewed energy, if you will. And the result
without any kind of viable political critique on the other side.
Exactly.
Except in very small pockets, small pockets, in a sense.
So I think if
it
we
becomes more of a narrative than an analysis, it doesn't really address what you call systemic issues.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course we're gonna get with Becker and his concept of human capital. That's a symptom of the process of generalized proletarianization, this profound impoverishment of thought, of feeling, of aesthetics, of doing, of knowing what to do, right? All these losses are perfectly in tune with such a view of what is human. Humans reduced to, capital. It's really sad that somebody like that is seen as an intellectual titan of our time.
And no accident that he comes up with this after the 60s generation that says, why work? Right. In a sense, this is very interesting that the why work, moment, and the refusal of work, another thing. And Kristen, is she still here? No, anyway, she's done work on the zero work stuff, how that, was completely eliminated by the Becker hypothesis, which, again, and the Chicago boy, the School of Economics, which really fed the Reagan Revolution, right? In so many ways, it fed this new revolution in terms of the entrepreneurialness of the self, right? That Foucault will talk about, that, our friend Chiarina Cordella in Greece is big on from a psychoanalytic point of view. What happened to the self? Well, it became the entrepreneur of the self, or, lifestyle, right? In a way, this was another thing that became part of the consumer moment, right? In a sense. Yeah. So
no, it's interesting. And so if we ask the follow-up question, so what is another question through which we could maybe try to make sense of the ongoing political crisis in the world today? And of course it is a crisis. I mean, there's no other way to resolve systemic and structural or strategic differences than through war. Once you've reached that stage on a global scale, right, not on a local scale, you're in a deep political crisis. I mean, that's another way of that's another symptom of it. But I think another thing we could ask is by interrogating further this distinction which I made last time between the usefulness of thinking about politics through the lens of structural versus systemic events, right? Systemic versus structural. Systemic meaning capitalism itself, or its contra-capitalist or socialist alternative as it existed, and maybe it still will exist with China again, as once China has decided, China seems to be deciding to re-enter that battle recently. That's systemic, right? Systemic refers to the predominant political and economic system that exists in the world, versus structural. And structural we can also use as a synonym of the word strategic. So structural crises can precipitate systemic change, right?
You say structural is a mediation between systemic and then the strategic, yeah?
No, I'm saying
that'd be fair to say. I mean, I'm just as a Hegelian, is it a mediation?
There is a mediation, right? So structural crises can be, if we follow what we started to do last time, borrowing from military theory and etc.
Right.
Structural crises can be experienced on 3 levels. The levels of strategy, operations, and tactics. Right, and we're going to talk more about this later as we try to develop this. And the interaction of operational, tactical, and strategic political events determine the structural kind of makeup of the system, right? So structural crises can lead to systemic crises, can threaten capitalism itself, but they don't necessarily have to have. So structural crises don't necessarily have to have systemic effects, but systemic change can never happen without structural crises, that kind of thing, right? And I think, I'm not sure about this, but it seems to me that for something to count as a structural crisis, it has to be either on the level of strategic events or operational events, not on tactical events. So as we said last time, anarchist politics cannot produce structural crisis in the system. Other types of politics, a general strike, a real general strike, may have systemic effects very quickly, or not, depends on the configuration, right? And so I think if we look at contemporary politics through the lens of structural versus systemic crisis, and we make a parallel to the last time we had major systemic challenge to capitalism, meaning the period from 1917, let's say, through, let's say, the first 20 or 30 years, from 1917 through the end of World War II, I think an interesting comparison emerges, which maybe gives us an opening to search for answers about our own present crisis. So, for example, if we were to schematically kind of present this, and let's say in the 1920s, systemic crisis in capitalism was expressed on at least 3 different levels. And the first level, you could say, was the existence of new political organizational forms. So new ways of doing organized politics emerged with 1917, which basically made it possible to engage in contra-systemic or anti-systemic or anti-capitalist, for brevity's sake, politics. Now, what was the kind of new political organizational form that emerged in that period? And perhaps the most important one, the one that had most influence, was Lenin's party of a new type. And Lenin's party of a new type was the Bolshevik party that evolved from the late 19th century through its moment of political victory between 1917 and 1945, right, if you will. It was a new type of a political party. What was new about it? It was a political party / army. It was organized as a hierarchical military organization, which had and tolerated wide horizontal dissent and internal democracy. But if we stop there, this would be no different necessarily from well-functioning social democratic parties of the period, like the German Social Democratic Party. But Lenin's party had the additional element, which was, this was a party of professional politicians, if you will, professional revolutionary politicians. I don't want to use the word politicians because that's a dirty word and it's been dirtied with contemporary usage. But the period of systemic crisis, which emerged with the Russian Revolution of October 1917, which was directed against in its political orientation capitalism as a system, was possible because there was in existence a new political organizing form, right? So then the next question becomes today: is there a new political organizing form, political organizational form in existence in practice today? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that's a question worth asking and studying. Is there a counter-systemic, anti-capitalist political organizational form today in existence? Or is there a new political organizational form that is capitalist, that is organized by the bourgeoisie or whatever? have political organizational forms today that are controlled by capitalists differ in their form, in their essence, in their functioning, than the political organizational forms of that social class 30 years ago. I think that's one of the important questions in answering will give clarity to understanding what the political crisis of today is. Yes, Mike.
If I could just add, when you speak of Lenin and the new type of party, Fred Jameson wrote a book, I don't know, people somewhat may be aware of it, called American Utopia, Dual Power and the Universal Army. And I think that's a play, if you will, on what you're doing, right? In a sense, he speaks about this. And, this was attempted in the United States too, in the 1850s, to have this. And Jameson's thesis is if you have a universal army, you're able to really organize things, healthcare, every education, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a kind of demilitarization in a sense. There is a lecture, as Beth put in the chat, Stanley and Jameson did a fundraiser for the Left Forum back in the day, where they had a long conversation that's on YouTube, Aronowitz, Jameson on this book. Yeah. So anyway,
absolutely, it's a great.
American
I haven't read all of it, but
and the
I
Universal
read part
Army.
of it.
Yeah, go ahead. And it's about dual power, as you know, right? I mean, and dual power was something Lenin understood extremely well, better than anybody in my
right. But I think I want to add also about Lenin's party, which because I think this might be something that's maybe less widely disseminated about that organizational form, is that one of the differences about Lenin's approach to and people like him in that political formation now known as the Bolshevik Party, one of their goals was informational and intellectual superiority. In other words, one of the primary battlefields, if you will, political battlefields that Lenin's organization of a new type engaged in was they sought to achieve hegemony in the world of ideas connected to politics.
Right.
So there was a deliberate and consistent attempt to outdo, in terms of the battle of ideas about politics, the bourgeoisie and its representatives.
Right.
So, which we've completely lost today, and in the anti-capitalist kind of counter. So, in other words, one of the new things about Lenin's party of a new type was, first of all, it was a contra-elite party. I think that's an incredibly important and useful concept. It was a contra-elite party. It targeted the politics and the power of the existing elites. And you do that, first of all, by undermining their political philosophy, their ideological space or ideological field that disseminates to millions of people under your political control, how to make sense of their life. So the first weapon, I think, of the Lenin's party of new type was assaulting the hegemony of ideological space of the capitalist class. In other words, Antonio Gramsci, who was a Bolshevik, he was the Italian application of Lenin's party of a new type, right? And this is why Mussolini said we have to stop this mind from working, because Mussolini understood very well, because Mussolini's fascism, borrowed elements from Lenin's party of a new type. He understood the importance of intellectual warfare. The US military calls it informational superiority on the battlefield, right, making sense of what is happening accurately before the opponents do, so you can use it against them to your advantage. Lenin's party did that. Obviously, the bourgeoisie's political organizations did that also, but Lenin's party was successful in a way. So Gramsci understood this, and Gramsci said, every human being can be an intellectual. Working people, the working class, is also firmly capable of making sense of the world of ideas. All ideas that permeate everyday life, the working class can make sense of it too. We just need to train ourselves to do that, just the way the other side does. Mussolini, of course, knew this because he was not stupid by any means in politics. It would have been too easy if he was. And he said, we need to basically lock up Gramsci because his party, his approach to politics undermines our power on the first level and most important strategic level, which is informational superiority, right? So in other words, I think the first question is, is there a parallel organization of a new type today that plays a similar contra-elite role to the Bolsheviks, and vice versa? Does the capitalist class have they invented new forms of political organization that serve their needs today that we need to be aware of and understand how they work, and etc. The second and related, I think, point that shaped structural and systemic crises 100 years ago, just like they do today, is this question of how do we make sense of what's happening in politics? What is our ideological sense-making apparatus? And what is the predominant ideological field or space that we are forced to live in? What are the words that we use to make sense of what's happening? How do we think about certain things? How do we think about healthcare or COVID, or what we should do about it? Or how do we make sense of what happens to us at work? Or why are our students facing such difficulty, etc.? In other words, 100 years ago, 3 new political ideological forms emerged in capitalism's crisis, marked by the October Revolution. Liberalism already existed, but 3 new ideological fields or spaces emerged, or ways of thinking about politics emerged, which were responses to the crisis. That was obviously revolutionary Marxism of the Soviet type. That was Mussolini's fascism, which was rooted, because Mussolini, of course, emerged from the Socialist Party and was well read in revolutionary Marxism of his day. And of course, in Germany, the National Socialist movement, which had 2 wings, right? They had the National Socialists, the left wing, if you will, of the Nazi Party, which was killed off in the Night of the Long Knives, who had anti-capitalist class kind of rhetoric and politics, but that was all wrapped up in a racist politics of a race war. And you had the right wing of the party, which made its peace with capital, as long as it was aligned with winning the race war, right? So Nazism replaced class warfare with race warfare, and the Bolsheviks replaced liberal and kind of aristocratic imperial elite politics with class warfare, and the formation of new elites, contra-capitalist elites. So the question today is there a new political ideology active that maybe has supplanted or is supplanting liberalism in the United States, both in its conservative Republican Party form and its kind of liberal Democratic Party form? And I think my proposal is, I think there is a new emerging way of making sense of politics, a new political ideology emerging, and that is socialized cybernetics, which has elements of liberalism, but I think in a very troubling way, at least to me so far, I think it also has elements of direct kind of racist politics, connected to questions of transhumanism and human improvement and the formation of new biologically distinct, in the very near future, forms of human beings with all kinds of implants and augmentations and medical devices, which will give them a qualitative advantage, they're hoping, in living longer and healthier lives, if you can, of course, afford to get them, or if you're granted access to them, etc. So in the systemic and crisis of today that capitalism is facing, I think we do have an emerging new political ideology which we need to make sense of. We need to try to understand it. It's hard because it's happening right now, and maybe it hasn't well congealed yet, but I think it's some kind of a form of liberalism mixed with I don't know, new form of race, or maybe a rehashing of some kind of new form of racist politics of the body, improving the body, those who can be improved and those who cannot, and etc. And I think you're going to see this very clearly in the thinking of the early theoreticians of cybernetics, who basically had thought very lowly of human beings, and that kind of dismissive view of human nature and what human beings are and what human life is and human capacities are is the entry point for genocidal racist politics. So I think, and then the third kind of factor that shaped the previous systemic crisis of politics and was responsible for the emergence of the politics of the 20th century was the scientific field, where in the early first 20 years of the 20th century, right at the time when capitalism is facing its systemic crisis, first by the World War between the capitalist imperial forces, and then with the emergence of a contra-capitalist political anti-systemic, anti-capitalist project, which was the Soviet revolutionary Marxism, you had developments in science which were revolutionary as well. And of course, these were, the transformations in physics, which changed not only our view of the natural world, but were also actively harnessed in human kind of economics, right? So we have Einstein's theory of relativity, special and general relativity, which was a revision of fundamental physics. And after that Einstein's intervention, the previous dominant schools of making sense of the natural world, Newtonian physics, became a subset of Einstein's general theory of relativity. And then shortly thereafter, you have the formation of a new type of physics, which was quantum mechanics, the study of infinitesimally small matter on an infinitesimally small scale and the energies thereof and how to make sense of that. All of this required a new mathematical apparatus and a new philosophy of science. And of course, it found its practical application in a new form of weaponry, which was the atomic bomb, right? Which completely obviously affected politics and economics thereof. So my question, and so of course, if we apply this, so that we have to ask the question, is there a new scientific development comparable to Einstein and the invention of quantum mechanics and the associated mathematical techniques? Is there something like that we're living through today, which has the ability to transform the political and economic structures of today? And I think, I don't know, I think people talk about big data and et cetera. So I think we can provisionally say the scientific breakthrough of today, which corresponds to that, would be the invention and the mass dissemination of cybernetics and its related branches of science. Of course, it's much less revolutionary than quantum mechanics and Einstein and the associated theories of mathematics. So perhaps, but we have to make sense of it. So in other words, what is the conceptual apparatus that is responsible for cybernetic structures today, more commonly known as the internet and its particular applications, big data, now big data's application to mimicking and simulating human intelligence, through so-called, this artificial intelligence and increasingly the applications like chat GPT and natural language processing. So artificial intelligence, I'd like to propose, I want to call that simulated approximation of human intellect. Because it's simulated, because it's not a living thing, and it's approximated because it doesn't have the ability to think. But yet it simulates it.
For a technical thing, Matt, can we keep recording? Yeah.
No.
You have to cut the recording here.
Okay, but that's fine because we're at the 2-hour mark. So if you want to just pick up
mark, I just wanted to add one thing to what Arto was saying, and sorry, I had to go catch something in the back here. But anyway, I just wanted to say, I think it's important for us to think about the revolution, the scientific revolution in terms of the cybernetic revolution now at this point, and think of the internet as a new war machine that's based on the highway system in the United States. It's really based on the interstate. When you really think about it, what was the early language which always was used, right? With the highway system, right? As a decentralized tool of internal mobilization. So this is something we could really start talking about in a very different way, because we're always thinking about what is this cybernetic revolution that we're undergoing and living. You know, what a mistake in some ways, and this is the way I'm starting to experience this, to call neoliberalism, right? In a sense, it's much deeper than just neoliberal policies and stuff like that. You know, at this point, what is really going on behind this? And I don't know if you agree with me or not, Arto, on this, but I think we, you know, one frame, I mean, or beyond the frame, is this cybernetic revolution, right? And, you know, and many of its manifestations and how it works. Yeah.
So I think nearing the 2 hour mark. So
okay.
Stop, but I think these are to me, these are useful questions, which is beyond the what does it mean to be human, and how we can answer that question in a way that dismisses the reduction of human life to human capital, or the even worse, the reduction of human life to computer-like functioning. You know, because contemporary, you know, cognitive neuroscience in its predominant schools of thought views the human mind as a computing machine, which to some of the other, you know, Sir Roger Penrose, you know, one of the main great physicists of our time, he finds that to be extremely laughable oversimplification of the process. You know, what a pathetic assumption to reduce human mind with all of its inherent kind of vastness and vagueness, which suggests that if you're going to use the language of physics, maybe you should assume that the human mind follows the laws of quantum mechanics, and then that might better represent the vastness and the kind of beauty of the human mind, massive, parallel, simultaneous kind of events which can never be captured through definitive numbers and precisely located, but only through statistical approximations, etc. Why would you treat the human mind as a computer, input-output machine? Right? So okay, and then if we follow and if we ask the question okay, well, what is socialized cybernetics? You know, how do we make sense of this thing? You know, both as a scientific field, but also what changes when cybernetics as a scientific field becomes functioning as the dominant political ideology, right? So I think this is a good place to. And of course, it seems to be producing, we can talk about in our future meetings, it seems to be producing a changed political subjectivity away from citizens, you know, the liberal language or et cetera, the French Revolution. And citizens are now becoming digital social objects, which are maybe perhaps treated not differently from any other digital object in a database. Or what is the next stage of dehumanization following generalized proletarianization? Well, maybe we're being reduced even further to biological beings with some latent human capacities, and obviously the need to reject that and articulate a contra vision of political subjectivity, right? So I think this becomes kind of like the program for further inquiry.
Yeah, great. I would add to that too. Maybe we can start, I mean, later on looking at the body as the place of struggle too. You know, how this, you know, biological capable, you know, beings with human capacity, capabilities is being kind of reaffirmed as the body as a place of experimentation and as the new model of consumption, and how much research is going into that and how much the internet plays upon that. You know, and to really think about this in terms of, you know, a kind of banal libidinal economy vis-a-vis the body versus that of the breaking of the old mind-body split. Because in a sense, what we're doing too in cybernetics is the mind-body split is coming back. This is a kind of new Cartesianism at this moment that is happening, right? So we can speak to that too. So yeah.
So I think this opens up, and so next week with Wilden, I think it's very interesting. Before we even read some of the thoughts of the cyber theorists of cybernetics, which we will, right, Michael? Like from Wiener and
yes. I've been going over Wiener to see which one's the most successful.
But before we do that, it'll be fun. It'll be interesting to read Wilden, who's this really creative thinker, and what is his take on the fundamental ontological, you know, the fundamental sense-making difference here, the analog versus the digital. And of course, one of the most interesting conceptualizations of data that I read recently was by this thinker by the name of, I can find it real quick here, Rob Kitchen. Rob Kitchen, in a big book on data structures and etc., he uses this working definition of data. He says, data is a specific abstract object which is pre-analytical and pre-factual.
Right.
Which is, I mean, that's very, that we should spend some time thinking about this. And then he says, and then I just extrapolated, in this sense, data are abstractions containing minimal inherent meaning. Right? They are that which exists, and I'm quoting here Kitchen, that which exists prior to argument or interpretation that converts them to facts and evidence. So in other words, to live in a data-based society where this kind of data is how we kind of make sense to each other and communicate with each other, is to actually communicate while abandoning not just thinking, but by abandoning factual reasoning itself. And just to engage in simple repetition, and I guess we're back in Deleuze in a certain way, right? Repetition and difference.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Good.
I mean, maybe this is a good place.
Yeah, Leslie, nice to see you. You know, I'm sorry we're beginning at 4:30. I hope you didn't think we began at 6:30 because Arto is in Bulgaria.
I'm sorry, I
For him, it's
apologize.
1:30 in the morning, but he's still going strong, to put it.
Oh yeah, I don't. Yeah, you don't
know,
need to sleep.
I can go to 3:30 a.m., but for Arto, I want him to get sleep because he's a young man.
Oh, I can go to 3:30, Michael.
Yeah. I know.
Thank you. I
Right.
missed last week. I'm so sorry.
Okay, well, they're going to be Matt, who's no longer here, but he's got the recording. He's going to put up tonight's session. John will be doing that, as well as the session from the last 2 weeks, I think. They'll be going up online, right?
Oh, terrific. Thank you. That's
So
wonderful.
everybody will have that information. And next week's reading, again, as Arto introduced it, is Tony Wilden's text, Analog and Digital Communication, from chapter 7 in System and Structure. You know, his great book, which is worth reading in its entirety, slowly and, conscientiously. But, again, yeah. We're in the given time. We don't really, we try to sometimes rush too much through this, but this is an excellent study of forms of exchange, right? In communication. It's really a study of exchange value, ultimately, in terms of the cybernetic moment, right? And new forms of communication. And this is someone, I want to just say this about Wilden. He was switching from a Lacanian, what he took from Lacan and structural psychoanalysis, or French Freud, if you will. He made a move from this towards Edgar Morin's work on communication. He went to Paris and studied communications theory with Morin in Paris after this. And he sort of slowly broke with the structuralist position, right, in French thought. So to be aware of this, that he started to branch out much more, right, in this way. So it's kind of a very interesting character in the is Tony Wilden. After this, he wrote a book on the war between the sexes called Men and Women, and then a few other things. But yeah, extremely well published, at least through the 80s, and to me, one of the seminal thinkers of this period, and someone still very relevant for today. I don't know if you want to say any more about him, Arto, but it's really an amazing work in terms of the critique of Western centrism, critique of phallocentrism that he goes through in terms of the feminist movement, his notion of the use of the Lacanian symbolic order to do this. But the sections we're reading are very relevant to what we're doing here on Homo Datum, analog and digital communication. Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I think, just maybe in conclusion, I think so. One of the things that bothered me personally for myself and my own kind of difficulties in making sense of the political crisis today, because I think this kind of rather strong and maybe persistent defeat of that dominant force of contra elite and contra systemic politics in the 20th century, which was revolutionary Marxism, is and I think this crisis is partially reflected in the methodological weakness. Like, in other words, we have lost the tradition that we're in. We've lost the intellectual superiority or informational superiority, to use the military term that is so popular today, relative to political opponents. And so when Gramsci was talking 100 years ago that we need to strive for hegemony, we need to engage in counter-hegemonic, and that's his way of saying counter-systemic politics, that implies that that kind of politics begins, first of all, on the level of informational / ideological, all of that is to say, ultimately philosophical battles. You know, the battles through which the categories and the forms, to use Aristotle's language, the categories and the forms through which people make sense of the world. And to the sense that these categories and forms are vastly impoverished today because of the capitalist class, its own degradation and proletarianization. Maybe this is an opportunity, right, for new type of sense making, to introduce concepts and forms of thinking about politics that are more meaningful than the ones that are on the airways today. You know.
And one that, again, fits very well with the Institute for the Radical Imaginations project. How do we build new categories? How do we, not only destroy the old, but how do you form new categories of understanding, if you want?
Because I think, and this is maybe
Kantian about it, the radical imagination is always connected to the productive imagination, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think the ideas always come before the action.
Yes.
I mean, we can use examples, right? We can use the Protestant Reformation. The idea came before the centuries of anti-Catholic struggle, if you will. The ideas always come before. There's always this delay in politics, right? Where the action is always delayed because it needs time. The ideas need to sink in. The critiques, the counter-systemic critiques need to sink in. Obviously, they're informed by lived life. But the ideas that emerge in the struggle always anticipate the action, right? But the problem is, if there's no ideas, no counter-systemic action can ever emerge, right? So in other words, political struggle, counter-systemic action is too complicated of a thing to do spontaneously. I mean, that seems to be the empirical evidence. It doesn't mean that it won't go that way, but that seems to be true in history so far, right? So in other words, once a Marxist who's dissatisfied, or any human being who's dissatisfied with living under capitalism for obvious reasons, focuses strictly studying political economy and critiquing existing capitalist political economy, if that's all we do, that's a shortage of ideas, if you will, necessary to engage in counter-systemic struggle. There's got to be other additional things that we study and we critique in addition to that. So I think this is one of the motivations of maybe studying cybernetics and, et cetera, to get away from the trap of studying political economy as the default thing that we do if we're dissatisfied with capitalism.
Yes, and it's interesting, since the Reagan Revolution, it's the economists that have been front and center. It's no longer the, quote, literary theorists, the great sociologists, et cetera. It's the economists. So with all due respect to Harvey, Rick Wolf, Michael Hudson, et cetera, we're trying to, be a little more imaginative in our approaches, even though, I mean, on some levels, there's a lot of respect for what they do, and their ways, right? And their interventions, and they're extremely well-meaning revolutionaries. But at the same time, there's a lack. To put it in Lacanian terms, there's a really lack in there that needs to be thought, and how to begin to question that void that's lacking, whether we call it the aesthetic dimension, which I like Arto talking about what would be a political aesthetics, the cultural dimension, and all these kind of things. How much we become one-dimensional Homo economicus, both in the way we live and also in the way that the Marxist tradition now looks at us, right? Only through the idea of the Homo economicus. So I think we're trying to break from that, in terms of a new kind of avenue, the cybernetics. Yeah. So, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, maybe this is what do you think? This is a good place to stop?
Yeah,
or-
it's a good place to stop, yeah. And thank you, and thank you for staying up late, but we'll do
Oh,
the
it's okay.
same thing next week. You're okay, right? You're
Oh,
not
yeah.
disturbing, okay, good, all right, good. And Beryl gets up early, and for Leslie and Sebastian, I guess it's early in the day still, the afternoon, right? It's about 3 in the afternoon or 3:30 or something like that, 4 o'clock. Yeah, good. Okay, and everybody else is, I guess, New York, East Coast time, et cetera, except for Ezra, right? I think you're elsewhere. So, yeah. And
Can I just ask for clarification?
Yeah.
What time are we starting next week?
4:30, because Arto is in the great nation state of Bulgaria.
I see. So going forward, it's going to be
It's going to
4:30.
be 4:30 because he's in the nation state of Bulgaria, right? 7 hours ahead. Right. So he's
Okay.
starting at 11:30 p.m., right?
Thank you. Now I
If
understand.
we do anything during the summer when I'm in Greece, I did classes at midnight till 2 in the morning. So anyway, we'll figure it out if we do anything during the summer. But yes, 4:30, and I think Matt sent out the Zoom with the 4:30. I think it was, he should have had that in the caption, right? That it
Yeah.
begins at 4:30. Yeah.
But I didn't get the caption because I arrived late. So
Okay, no problem. But I meant when he sent out the Zoom link, I think he had it on. He should have had that in the message that it started at 4:30. But anyway, we'll correct it if not, if there's any confusion. So it'll be, I think, what is it? Next week is the November the 1st, Wednesday. Yeah. Yeah, November 1st. So we'll be back 4:30 with more of the recapitulations of what we're doing, but at the same time trying to engage Tony Wilden's book, the analog and digital communication in the light of exchange value. Yeah, and et cetera. Okay, yeah, good. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Good to see you. And thank you, Arto, for taking up
Thank you. Yeah.
the mantle here tonight, as usual. Yeah, good to have you back. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Okay. So everybody, be well, and see you in the future, as our
Next week.
comrade Francis says. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good.
Thank
Okay. You too. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye. Okay.